Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show today. It's me, Jeff. Thank you for tuning in to the Voluntary View. And today we've got a very special guest. We've got Dave Roland from the Freedom Center of Missouri. So we ran into these guys quite by happenstance. We were Googling Missouri and we found their website it's Mo Freedom. Is it .org or .com?
MoFreedom.org, yeah.
.org. Okay, good. And of course, MO is the postal code for Missouri. So I thought I was hooked immediately with MoFreedom.org. But
I have to give credit to my wife for that one. She's the one who realized that this would be the perfect web address for us. So Jennifer gets all the credit on that.
It's really good. It's really good. So Dave, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Now, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about what the Freedom Center of Missouri is and what it does?
Sure. The Freedom Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest litigation firm. What that means is we look for cases that will help us move the rule of law in a pro-liberty direction. And we do that by focusing on a handful of issues. We focus on property rights, economic liberty, religious liberty, free speech, and then also more general constraints on the power of government. We've got some really excellent provisions of the Missouri Constitution in terms of limiting the size and scope of government. The real challenge is just getting the courts to enforce those. So that's the task that we've taken upon ourselves, is to try and make use of these excellent constitutional provisions that we have in the Missouri State Constitution.
Now, when you say they're excellent constitutional provisions, what exactly do you mean? Like they limit the power of the state, or what?
Yes, they are designed to safeguard individual liberty in many instances, but then also there are specific limitations put on the power of the state in certain regards. One example is that Missouri's protections for the freedom of speech are actually significantly more explicit and more expansive than the First Amendment. So the First Amendment limits itself to saying Congress shall make no law restricting the free exercise of speech, or rather the freedom of speech. But the Missouri Constitution specifies that every citizen has a right to communicate whatever they will, no matter by what means, on any subject that they will. So it's more detailed, more expansive than the simple text of the First Amendment. And we have a number of other provisions built into our Constitution that, if interpreted as they're written, basically raise the bar for individual liberty higher than the federal Constitution does. And again, the challenge is getting the courts to actually follow these wonderful written provisions. There are also some fantastic restrictions on the legislature and how they are permitted to adopt laws. So, for example, we've got a provision that says that every bill introduced in the legislature can only deal with a single subject, and that the original subject of the bill cannot be changed in the course of its passage through the legislature.
So no omnibus bills or anything like that.
That's the idea. It's supposed to stop omnibus bills, and also supposed to prevent log rolling, where you see that one particular bill has a lot of support and traction, and so you start tacking on amendments that aren't even necessarily related, because no one wants to vote against the core purpose of this bill. That's what these provisions are designed to do, is to prevent these legislative games, basically. It's been hit or miss as far as how effectively the courts have actually applied these. But again, that's why you need a public interest litigation group to come along and start choosing cases strategically to try and push the courts back in the right direction, where they've been ignoring the plain meaning and intention of these constitutional limitations on government. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So
okay.
It sounds like I keep wanting to say the Mo Freedom, but the Missouri Center for Freedom.
The Freedom Center.
thank you, there it is, the Freedom Center. They focus on specific cases that are related to individual liberty, etc., and they litigate for those in the courts so that, would you say, like making it easier for the judge to make the right pro-liberty decision? Or
Yes. Okay. So let's give you a little bit of background. The idea of public interest litigation actually goes back into the 19th century, when you had the 14th Amendment adopted, and so the protections of the federal Constitution have now been applied to the states. And you still had a lot of states, not just southern states, but significantly southern states, that were imposing black codes on the newly freed slaves. So they were basically treating them as second-class citizens. And some folks came up with the idea of a strategic challenge to some of the segregation laws. So they got a man named Homer Plessy, who was a very wealthy businessman in Louisiana. He was 1/8 African American, and actually could pass as white in many contexts, but he was technically black. And they had him go and buy a train ticket to sit in the white section of a train. And the whole idea was they knew that he would be told, no, you're not allowed to sit here. You got to move, into a different carriage. And the whole idea was to say, it is unjust and unconstitutional that this person who is well respected, who could pass as white, is not allowed to sit in the same section as these other Americans. They failed. And it gets up to the US Supreme Court, and in Plessy v. Ferguson, they say, nope, if states want to segregate people by race, that is perfectly okay. So this first effort at public interest litigation was unsuccessful, but it sparked an entire movement afterwards. So in the early 20th century, you had groups like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the ACLU, deciding that they wanted to take cases like this, where they use a specific circumstance to highlight the injustice of a particular law, so that you can then get it into the court. It makes it harder for a judge to rule the wrong way when you have a very sympathetic client, when you have a really ugly government villain that you're fighting against, and when there's just kind of this drama surrounding the real world facts of the case. And then even if you end up losing in court, having told your story publicly and highlighted this injustice, it creates the opportunity for legislative reform. So you're fighting the battle not just in the court of law, but also in the court of public opinion. And it took a long time for these strategies by the NAACP and the ACLU to bear fruit, but ultimately you did start seeing shifts in the right direction. So the ACLU, in a very significant sense, created free speech law in the early 20th century, with its set of cases saying, look, the government doesn't get to punish people because they've expressed ideas. The NAACP eventually won Brown versus Board of Education, which says, no, separate is inherently unequal. Segregation cannot be considered constitutional. But that was 8 decades after Plessy versus Ferguson. So starting in the 1970s, some conservative and libertarian groups realized the value of this public interest playbook. And so they started trying to use that model to accomplish individual liberty and limits on government in other areas. So groups like Pacific Legal Foundation out on the West Coast, the Institute for Justice in Washington, D.C., and a number of other groups throughout the country start pursuing their own versions of strategic litigation. We find people who have been denied the right to earn a living, and they have incredibly sympathetic stories to tell. The government villains are completely outrageous. And when people hear these stories in the news, they think this law is ridiculous. Surely it's got to be unconstitutional. And so even if we end up losing the case in the courts, we move the needle of public opinion until ultimately, hopefully, we can effect a greater freedom for society, even if we don't necessarily succeed in that primary objective of winning the court case. But that's how the public interest strategy really works overall, and we're part of that broader movement in public interest law.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love the history of that. So how, you say it goes all the way back to the Jim Crow laws, etc. But how did the
Yeah.
Freedom Center of Missouri itself get started?
Okay, so Jennifer and I, my wife is Jennifer. She is a Missouri native, and we both worked for the Institute for Justice in Washington, D.C. I was incredibly blessed. That was my first job out of law school, litigating with IJ. And Jennifer and I fell in love and decided we were going to get married. And we wanted to get back to one of our home states, and we had the opportunity to come back to Missouri. And when we looked around at the landscape here, there were a lot of free market organizations that were working on the policy level. They did not have a group like IJ that's focused on litigating for individual liberty. And we thought, you know what, this is our skill set, this is our training. Let's go ahead and let's start an organization that's going to function like IJ to try and advance the ball for individual liberty in the courts. So we started the Freedom Center in 2010, October of 2010, and we have been hard at it for about 11 and a half years now. We've had some, really phenomenal successes. We've had some heartbreaking losses, but the long and the short of it is we are going to keep at it until hopefully we can put ourselves out of business. Jennifer and I have always said our goal is to make freedom so pervasive that we no longer need a freedom center. That may take a while, just to be honest.
That's okay, one step at a time. But I love that. It's a love story as well as a freedom story, so that's great.
It is. Well, and if I could throw in there, I talked a little bit about the court of public opinion, and one of the things that's, I think, quite unique about what Jennifer and I have been able to accomplish with the Freedom Center is we have built incredible goodwill with the media outlets in this state. And that's not entirely uncommon for groups like ours, but the extent to which we've built that goodwill really is pretty spectacular. So we talk to folks on the conservative side of the spectrum, and they recognize and they love the work that we do on property rights and economic liberty and religious liberty and things like that. But they can't get their heads around why we always get such fantastic coverage from these, so-called liberal media outlets like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the Kansas City Star. And it's because Jennifer and I went out of our way to cultivate that from the very beginning. We went out of our way to demonstrate that the reason we care about liberty is in large part because it helps people who are dispossessed. It helps people at the lower ends of our economic spectrum. Like, liberty provides opportunity. Free markets create the potential for success. And when people start to understand that, unlike the caricature of libertarians as like these unfeeling, heartless Randians, when they see, no, we actually legitimately care about these communities that have been oppressed, and we see freedom as the way to remedy that oppression, they get it. Now, they're not necessarily persuaded on everything at front, but they really appreciate where we're coming from. So I'm sure you're aware, almost every major city has an alt weekly that's usually like super, super far left. And, it's the free paper that's out, all over the streets or whatever. They actually ran a story about how Jennifer and I got married. And it's because we had cultivated this relationship with Danny Wichenkowski, who is the reporter. And he put out a call saying, I'm interested in writing a story about how a loss turned into something good. And so I was able to talk to him about how when IJ lost Kelo versus New London, the big eminent domain battle in 2005, that loss is what led Jennifer to come and work at IJ. So if we had not lost that case, we never would have gotten married. The Freedom Center wouldn't exist. And so they told this story in this alt weekly, and it was glowing, and it expressly talked about, these two libertarians who are, passionate about property rights and protecting people against losing their homes and businesses. That's why the work that we do is so important, because we're not only focused on the Constitution and the law, we're focused on selling these ideas to people who are not already part of the choir. Right? So frequently, people within the liberty movement are content to just talk to and more frequently argue with people who really actually agree with them on almost every issue. And Jennifer and I, we consider ourselves to be evangelists for liberty. If we're actually going to accomplish more freedom in our society, we need to convert people. We need to persuade people about the benefits of liberty and the wisdom of constitutional limits on government. That's what we're doing. We're out there with our case selection, with the way that we talk about our cases in the media, and with the relationships that we've built. We are selling people on the idea of liberty.
That's fantastic. And
Thank you.
That's the way you really get to the heart of people, I think, is trying to help the little guy. Because property rights are property rights, but no one cares if you stand up for the property rights of billionaires or millionaires.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
yeah. Well, and the thing is, and this is something that so frequently gets, so for a lot of people on the left, the whole idea of property rights are just an abomination. But when they look and they can see that it's not usually the big wealthy people or the big corporations that are suffering from eminent domain, they realize, wait a minute, if we look at history, eminent domain was aggressively and explicitly racist in the way that it was used. These communities were trying to destroy their minority groups. They were trying to get rid of what they considered to be lower class citizens. And when you open the eyes of someone on the left to the tremendous injustice and the extreme harm that these minority and poor communities suffered for being deprived of their property rights, it definitely changes their outlook. It doesn't mean that they're going to turn themselves into flag-waving, anarcho-capitalists, but they start to understand why property rights are actually quite important, especially for poor people. So yeah, we think it's really important to sell these ideas.
I'd agree, absolutely. But you mentioned, of course, that not everything can be a success. You mentioned the big loss in eminent domain with IJ. I'm curious, what's one of the worst losses that the Freedom Center itself has suffered in court?
Oh, the worst loss that we suffered in court was a couple years ago. We challenged, it's a property rights case. We challenged a local government's ordinance that compelled every property owner to devote at least half of their lawn space to turf grass. So our client, I know, right? Yeah, I know. I see the look on your face. Our client was a 67-year-old cancer survivor with severe grass allergies. And when they bought their property, they went in and they tore out all the grass on their property and they replaced it with a beautiful, immaculately preserved garden. So they had lovely flowers and streams and fountains. They had ground cover that had the scale and the appearance of grass, but was not actually grass. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
And the city acknowledged, this is beautiful. We're not worried about weeds. We're not worried about vermin, but there's this whole thing of the fact that we do have this city ordinance that says half of your yard has to be turf grass. And so we sued and we said, if property rights means anything, it means the government doesn't get to dictate to you that you can't use your own property for this perfectly harmless and beautiful use. And the city fought us tooth and nail. Oh, by the way, the penalties for non-compliance were up to $250 per day that your property was out of compliance, and there was no upper limit on the fines that could be accumulated. The penalties also included up to 10 days in prison per day that you were out of compliance. So by the time we finished this case, at least in theory, they could have hit our clients for more than $350,000 in fines and 35 years in
Oh.
prison.
Yeah, how's
That's,
that for bad public relations with a cancer survivor?
I know, right? Well, this is the public interest model, playing
Mhm.
out right there. They were wonderful, wonderful clients. We had a great picture of Jan standing in front of her house with this beautiful garden around her, and she had a big flag that says "Flowers equal freedom." It was beautiful. Um, so we fought this case in first in state court, and the state court didn't want anything to do with the property rights aspect of it, and they told us to go back to the starting board in such a way that we felt like we could go ahead and bring the case in federal court and maybe get a better judge. So we brought it in federal court, and when all was said and done, the the judges at the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals figured out how to get rid of the case without giving us any opportunity ever to even get the property rights question addressed.
Oh,
You think that our legal system is set up to guarantee that everybody gets their day in court.
yeah, due
And let
process and all
me
of
tell
that.
you, and I know people who are not lawyers may be skeptical about, the lawyer saying this. We did everything we were supposed to do to preserve this issue. I mean, we did. We went by the book, what the courts had said about how to preserve this property rights issue for the courts to rule on it. And the Eighth Circuit just said, yeah, we don't think so. And because of the way they decided it, there was nothing we could do. Now, fortunately, the city was so beaten up after 5 years of litigation that even though technically they won that case, they never messed with Jan again. Um, they left her alone until the end of her days. She died just a couple of months ago, and she continued to maintain that garden until her dying breath. And so, in one sense, it's a victory. In the same sense that, I don't know if you're aware, but after losing Kelo versus New London, the city of New London never tore down Suzette Kelo's house.
Oh, I
Suzette
didn't.
Kelo's little pink house still stands in the city of New London. They moved it to a different location to get it out of the redevelopment footprint, but the city knew it would be a public relations catastrophe to show a wrecking ball coming and knocking down this little pink house that had been kind of the emblem of that case. And so this is one of the things that public interest law can do. Even if you don't necessarily win the court battle, you may be able to keep the government off the backs of at least that client. So, fortunately, like I said, Jan was able to live out the rest of her days with her garden, but that case still eats at me. And it's one of those situations, again, where it's so frustrating because we did everything as attorneys that we knew we were supposed to do, and then for the courts to kind of fail us in the way that they did it's very, very disheartening. But that's the exception rather than the rule. More frequently than not, we at least get a ruling on the merits. And if you get a ruling on the merits, then you've got the hope of taking it up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which we've tried a couple of times, although not yet successfully. But yeah, that's the case that I regret the most, the way that it ended.
Mm. I understand that. It could have been worse, granted, but that's the
Could
kind of
have,
thing
yeah.
you'd think, where's the sense in that of forcing everyone to have this much grass? As but we're currently in California, and a lot of people
Oh,
just have rocks because
yeah,
water is so expensive.
yeah.
So, uh,
Well, so we brought this up a little bit in that case. Um, Lawns are actually ecologically very unfriendly. I mean, they
yeah.
require a ton of water. They usually require pesticides
Yeah,
or
fertilizers.
herbicides of some sort. And that's just, it's not especially good for the environment. Now, a lot of people don't care, but a lot of people do care. And so it's weird because you have a lot of cities in drier areas or in more ecologically concerned areas that are passing the opposite kind of ordinances that are actually forbidding the maintenance of grass in yards. And now we don't favor that. I mean, basically, we think it's up to the property owner. The property owner should be able to make this decision for themselves. But it was absurd, and we thought quite repellent that the city would dictate to someone that they have to maintain a plant that makes them sick just outside of their house, just because the city says so. Not for any other reason, but because the city says so.
No. And even the lawn itself, it's just aesthetic. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
all.
exactly.
Ugh. So that that's a loss. But what about wins? You mentioned there are more wins than losses. So what's one of the best, biggest wins you guys have had?
Probably the best win that we have had overall was in 2016. We won a major election fraud case. So people hear about allegations of election fraud all the time. It's very, very rare that you can actually prove it. I'm one of the few attorneys in the country that has actually proven it. So what happened is over in North St. Louis, there was a Democratic dynasty. The family is called the Hubbards, and they basically ran North St. Louis for the better part of 30 years. But people kept raising questions. The elections that they were in when they had challengers had some very unusual features. There would be a flood of absentee ballots in these races, usually only in a couple of precincts. And although in most elections, the absentee ballots roughly mirror the kinds of votes that get cast at the polls. In other words, if a candidate wins at the polls 60-40, usually the absentee ballots will be in the neighborhood of 60-40 in favor of the winning candidate as well. When the Hubbards were on the ballot, they quite frequently lost at the polls, but they would win the election overall because of this flood of absentee ballots that broke like 85, 87% in favor of the Hubbard. And so people had been raising these questions for years, but no one had been able to prove anything. So I get this call in July of 2016 from a trio of progressive African-American Democrats who were challenging the Hubbards. And again, the reason that they called me is because the first thing that Jennifer and I did when we came to St. Louis is we went to North St. Louis and we talked about the evil of eminent domain and the importance of constitutional freedoms. From the very beginning, we planted our flag in the African-American community and let them know we are here to help. And we are nonpartisan. We are utterly unconcerned with what your politics are. We're concerned with what your rights are under the Constitution. And that helped us build a name and a reputation among this community such that in 2016, when these progressive politicians needed help, I was the one that they came to. And they said, we'd like you, we've asked the Board of Election Commissioners to investigate this weird pattern. They've refused to do it. Will you do the investigation for us? I said, absolutely, I will. And so we went and we filed a public records request to get all of this election data so that I could do this investigation. And they said, no, we're not going to give you the records. Well, so that turned into a lawsuit of its own. And we may get to that one later, but for now, my clients each lost their campaigns, but they lost by very narrow margins. And once again, we saw that same pattern of this flood of absentee ballots. So we filed a challenge to the outcome of these elections, and we said, there's election fraud taking place here. We're sure of it. We got in there and we finally were given, the courts ordered them to give us access to those election records that they had tried to withhold. And it was awesome because a couple of reporters from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch were in the room with me as we started going through all of these records, right? So they're doing the investigation from a journalism angle. I'm doing the investigation from a legal angle. And we're able to kind of cross-pollinate as we're going through it and discuss these ideas. Again, you want to talk about building goodwill. Fantastic way to do it. Stephen Deere and why am I drawing a blank on his colleague, Jeff Moore. They're still friends today. But they were in the room when I found the smoking gun. And the smoking gun was not quite what we expected it to be. Their shoe leather work in the community uncovered the Hubbard's game plan, like how they had been illegally applying for absentee ballot applications on behalf of people in the community, and then showing up when the ballots arrived in the mail and saying, here, let us fill those out for you. They uncovered a lot of that. But what I found was that the election authority itself had been illegally counting ballots that should have been excluded. So the absentee ballot laws are very clear about the information that has to be included when you are submitting your ballot. You have to swear an affidavit saying you are the person who's casting the ballot. And we found out that for a couple hundred of these ballots, no one ever filled out an affidavit. And the ballots weren't being stored the way the law says they're supposed to be stored. They weren't being counted the way the law says they're supposed to be counted. And so in a race that my client lost by 83 votes, we had nearly 280 ballots that were very definitely unlawfully counted. And even though we didn't know which way those ballots went, it didn't matter, because the difference between the ballots unlawfully cast and the margin of victory was so great that you just couldn't be sure that the outcome of the election was correct. And that's the standard that we had to meet. So the court agreed with us. The court said, yeah, given this clear counting of ballots that were unlawful, we can't be certain about the outcome of this election. We're going to have a special election. But here's what happened. While we were pursuing this in court, the Post-Dispatch ran a blockbuster story exposing the Hubbard operation. And when the people of St. Louis saw what had been happening, they turned on the Hubbards viciously. So when this new election came around, my client won by nearly a 3-1 margin. I mean, Bruce and Rasheen destroyed their opponents in this election.
That's fantastic.
And so Bruce became the state representative for the 78th district. He served for 3 years before retiring. And when he retired, my other client, Rasheen Aldridge, took his place. And Rasheen is now in his second year as state rep for the 78th district. So the Court of Appeals ended up issuing a fantastic opinion talking about the importance of confidence in our elections. And they talked about why it is so important that we make sure that our election laws are stringently followed. It was a wonderful opinion, and it's probably the best thing that I have done as an attorney so far. Certainly the biggest and most impactful win for the Freedom Center in our 12 years so far.
I love that story, especially bringing the media into it and their blockbuster story, as you put it. That's fantastic. So
yeah, that story is still out there online. It's totally worth reading for anyone who's interested. Yeah, it's a wonderful story.
That's pretty great. I'm curious though, with everything that's been going on the past couple of years, have you gotten a chance to do anything with the
we had a big win yesterday. Are you talking about go I'm sorry, I anticipated the question when maybe I shouldn't have. Go ahead.
No, I was wondering about if you've had any success with or done any work on the COVID stuff that's been going on. Because I know Missouri hasn't been as bad as some places. I live in California right now, so I know that. But
we wanted to jump in on that in the early days. So here's the problem that we face. We talked about the strategic litigation approach. And when you are dealing with legal principles, even incorrect legal principles that have been deeply enshrined for decades, in some cases more than a century, you've got to have just the right case if you want to challenge them. And so we were looking for just the right case. We didn't want something that was going to be on the margins. We wanted a really dramatic overreach by the government, and we thought we had it. So in the early days of the pandemic, the city of Springfield told a number of businesses, you're allowed to sell certain items, but you're not allowed to sell other items. So for example, Walmart could be open for the purpose of selling food and certain kinds of household goods. But if you wanted to buy a firearm or hunting or fishing equipment, nope, you weren't allowed to do that. Similarly, Bass Pro Shop, they could be open for the purpose of selling clothing items, but not hunting and fishing gear. At the same time, the city of Springfield also told churches, and remember, this was the pandemic hit right before Easter. And so a
Yes.
couple of the churches down in Springfield decided they were going to do drive-through Easter services. So it wasn't going to be indoors. People were going to be in their cars, socially distanced. The message was going to be delivered over the radio. And so people in their cars could listen to the message. If they wanted to say amen, they could flash their lights or they could even beep their horn or something. And then when it came time to serve communion, they had it rigged up so you could do kind of a drive-through communion service. It was all very well thought out and
Creative.
completely safe.
Hmm.
And the city said, no, you can't do this. This constitutes a gathering. I've never wanted to take on a case so badly in my life. Like,
Mhm.
this was the epitome of everything I've wanted to do in the law. And I couldn't find a client willing to file the suit. I talked to 7 churches down there. And to be clear, I understand what they ended up saying. They said, we're concerned about our witness to the community. Like, we don't want to be seen as just disregarding, basically it was, I don't know if you're a Christian, but in Romans 13, there is a conversation about the duty to obey the earthly authorities.
Mhm.
And they were concerned that filing that lawsuit might impair their witness. So I do understand the hesitation, but it hurt not to be able to bring that case. That would have been a winning case. As we've seen, we've seen that the Supreme Court eventually started shutting down those kinds of COVID orders, especially as they related to churches.
Mhm.
So I really wanted to do that. But after about the first 3 months of the pandemic, the city started to get much, much smarter, much, much more clever in how they were setting up their ordinances. And that made them a lot harder targets. We did tee up a potential challenge in late 2020 based on separation of powers, because a lot of these COVID orders were simply being handed down by fiat by executive officials and in many cases unelected bureaucrats. So it is one thing if you have a mayor who at least has been elected, even though they have not been elected to make law. At least they are directly accountable to the people.
Yeah.
But if you've got, some health department authority who's never been elected by anybody, and all of a sudden they're just making laws that people are bound to live by, that's a problem. That's a huge constitutional problem.
Mhm.
And so we had teed up that case, but again, it's so important with these cases, not only that you have the right issue, not only that you have the right villain, but that you also have the right client. And one of the things, and this is going to be controversial for a lot of people, and I beg their tolerance just by virtue of I understand what we need to make these things work. I asked the clients, I said, if you're going to do this, please refrain from posting on social media calling into question vaccines and masks and things like that, because from a public relations standpoint, that's going to make this a lot harder. It's going to make the case a referendum on the effectiveness of vaccines or the effectiveness of masks rather than the constitutional principle we're trying to vindicate. And if we're going to have a chance of winning, we've got to have the court focus like a laser on that constitutional principle. And in the end, the half dozen clients that we had lined up weren't willing to make that commitment. And I understand, and I support their decision that they wanted to keep making those posts. It just meant that we couldn't really use them as clients. And so yeah, we wanted to get involved, but we ended up largely sitting that out. And fortunately, there have been plenty of other groups and organizations that have kind of picked up that ball and run with it. And there have been some very good outcomes. And I anticipate there being more. I think that when some of these COVID orders end up in front of the US Supreme Court on the merits, I think maybe we're going to see a really good shift in the direction of the law. I can't guarantee it. Chief Justice Roberts seems likely to side with the liberal justices on that. But I think that the core of Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett is going to be strong. And I think that we'll see some positive decisions for liberty coming out of this whole situation eventually. The question is when, right? That's
right.
The real question, is when does the Supreme Court take one of these cases? And we just don't know the answer to that yet.
No, it's amazing how long things can take and how many things have to line up just right in order for it to work. Like you said, the one perfect case has got to be, the perfect client, the perfect situation, even the perfect judge, just to make things work. And
and people also don't recognize just how long it takes for litigation to happen. I mentioned our turf grass case. That was 5.5 years, start to finish. We've got a government transparency case right now in Jefferson City that we are approaching year 7. So my client requested records April 1st, 2015, and we've already won it. 4 years ago, we won a judgment requiring them to search for and produce these records, and they still haven't done it. So here we are, coming up on 7 years since our client requested these records, and they still haven't even searched for them. But we did get some good news a couple of weeks ago on that. We are hopeful that this time the judge is really going to hold their feet to the fire and make them do what they were supposed to do 7 years ago. But yeah, litigation can take an incredibly long time, and not a lot of people realize that.
So sounds like you're playing the long game in order to make Missouri a even more freedom-loving and freedom-friendly place.
Yeah, well, and that's the whole idea behind this strategic litigation, is you understand that it may well take decades. There may be certain issues that don't get resolved in my lifetime, and I recognize that. But when they are resolved, oh my gosh, it's sweet. It is so sweet. So one of the issues that I have worked on from the very beginning of my career is the problem of Blaine amendments, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically from the mid 19th century forward, many states put into their constitutions amendments that expressly prohibited the use of any public funding in what they called sectarian institutions. What they really meant was Catholic, but over the years, that's just true. That's historically what they meant. But over the years, it came to mean that you cannot use the public funding in any way that might benefit a religious person, even if that meant overtly discriminating against people of faith. So this is a really big problem for 2 reasons. Number one is school choice. So many school choice programs that allow parents to escape the confines of their public school system depend on there being a range of options available. And quite frequently, the range of options that is available includes, but is not limited to, parochial schools, religious schools. And so if you remove those religious schools from the equation, it really severely limits the choices that parents have, and thus limits the effectiveness of the policy for improving education overall. So that's one of it. But the other is just a pure discrimination problem. So there was a case a few years back out of Missouri, as a matter of fact, where the state had a program for lending money to help upgrade public playgrounds. And so a private organization that had a playground that was open to the public could apply for a grant that would then allow them to make the playground safer. Basically, they would put down a protective coating on the ground so that if children slipped and fell, they'd be less likely to get hurt, that kind of thing. Purely secular purpose to this program. Right. And so this church that ran a daycare that had a playground that was open to the community, they applied to participate in this program. They were one of the highest rated facilities for receiving the grant. And the only reason the state told them no is because they happened to be on the property of a church. I mean, it's just out and out, you are being removed from consideration because you are
It's
religious.
because of your religion. Yeah.
Exactly. That's a problem. And so the US Supreme Court agreed. That's a problem. 7-2. Justice Kagan even agreed that was unconstitutional. But then the issue came up again about whether these Blaine amendments that basically make school choice impossible if you're going to include religious schools as options, that question came up again. And it was argued just this year in a case argued a couple months ago. And it seems pretty clear the courts are about to knock down Blaine amendments and rule that they violate the First Amendment of the US Constitution. I've been working for this for 18 years. 18 years of my life, this has been an issue. And I'm finally about to see the fulfillment of it. And it is amazing. Now, if only we can get Kelo versus New London reversed so that eminent domain for private benefit is outlawed. And if only we can get the slaughterhouse cases from 1874 reversed so that economic liberty is a thing again, I can die a happy man. But like I said, the slaughterhouse cases, they've been on the books for almost 150 years now. That's a pretty steep hill to climb in terms of getting the courts to reverse it. So I understand there are parts of what we are trying to accomplish that may outlive me, but that's okay. Like our mission for the here and now is to advance the ball and to lay the foundation so that future generations of public interest attorneys with a libertarian perspective will ultimately see those battles won.
So what does the future of the Freedom Center itself look like?
That's a great question. One of the exciting and challenging things about public interest litigation is you can't necessarily build the cases that you want. You have to wait and see what circumstances present themselves. So for example, the turfgrass case, I never could have manufactured that case by myself. It just so happened one day I got a call from Jan Duffner and she said, "Hey, this is going on. Can you help?" And I said, yes, I can, or at least I can try. And so I don't know what facts are going to be presented in the coming years and how we might be able to use those facts to advance these constitutional principles. But what I can say is we are going to continue diligently keeping our eye open for just those cases that may ultimately help us move the courts in the right direction on these issues.
I think that's where having good relations and building good relations with the media, with the community, makes such a big difference. Because then when other people think of those, they'll think Freedom Center of Missouri, they're the folks to handle this.
Yeah.
And they come to you.
Well, and to be honest, yes, but that also sometimes presents a challenge in and of itself because we are a very small organization. It's really just Jennifer and me on staff. And so we've got very limited resources. Like our annual budget is usually in the neighborhood of $50,000-$60,000. And that's everything. Like that's not what I get paid. I don't get paid that. And so we get flooded with people asking for help or advice. I mean, scores of people every year sending us potential cases. Like already, so we're what, 4 weeks into January, and I've already gotten probably on the order of 36 potential case requests this month. Wow. And it's really difficult on a couple of different levels. Number one, it's difficult to sort through those, because it takes time to look through the materials that get submitted to us and try and decide, is this something we can help out with? Is this something that we can't? But also it can be difficult emotionally because you want to help. It's part of my nature to want to help people.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't be in this
really,
job
really hard to have to say no. But so for example, I got this request this last week. A guy here locally had a situation where he was improperly stopped by a police officer. The officer unlawfully told him he wasn't allowed to record their encounter. A lot of unconstitutional things went down in this stop. It is a good case. It's a case that under normal circumstances I would love to take. We don't have the resources. I'm completely swamped with what we've got on our plate right now, and it pains me to have to tell this guy no. But hopefully we can help him find another attorney who might be able to help him out.
I hope so. Now you mentioned operating funds. Where does the money to fund the Freedom Center come from?
We've got in the neighborhood of about 100 different individual supporters throughout the state. Some are able to give more, some are able to give less. We've got a couple of donors that are able to give us a couple $1,000s a year. Most of our donors are chipping in $10, $25 a month, which is welcome. We can use all of it. I've told people for a long time, if we could get 1,000 people willing to give us $100 a year, so less than $10 a month, that doubles our operating budget, basically. But because we are such a small organization, it's also hard to fundraise. We've applied for grants and have been unsuccessful so far in applying for grants. Every once in a while, when we win a case, we do win attorney's fees. We won a case yesterday that's going to give us attorney's fees. But those are actually few and far between. Even when you win cases, it's always hard to get attorney's fees. So this win yesterday was really quite a big deal. And we're hopeful that it's going to provide us much of what we need for an operating budget for the next year. But the jury is still out on that. We're not positive that that's going to be the ultimate amount that we get for attorney's fees, but we think we're going to be in good shape on that. But yeah, that's one of the things that makes us unique as well. Organizations like ours that do similar work, there are organizations out there that have budgets of $2.5, $3 million a year. They've got 4 to 6 attorneys on staff, and they're not handling as many cases as we're handling. So right now, the Freedom Center is handling 8 different cases, not counting in 2 days, I'm filing an amicus brief at the Missouri Supreme Court on a gun rights issue. And so, we really do, we're the most efficient organization of our kind anywhere. Like, you're not ever going to find anywhere else a public interest organization with 2 attorneys, only one of which is a full-time litigator, that's taking on that many cases. And we're doing it with, 1/5 the resources of organizations like ours. So we're really, really proud of that. But let me also add, I don't want this to be seen as a sob story. Like, we knew what we were getting into when we chose to do this. And we have made the decisions and the sacrifices that we've made because this is what we're passionate about. And if doing the work that we are so passionate about means that, we live in my in-laws' basement in Audrain County, Missouri, I'm fine with that. And I've told people, if some angel donor dropped $1 million on the Freedom Center tomorrow, we would not change where we live or where we work. We would funnel every bit of that into the organization, and we would hire on some help. But as far as our own personal individual circumstances, man, don't cry for us. We're perfectly happy with where we are. Our entire focus is wanting to make sure that the organization has the resources that we need to go out and fight these battles. You see what I'm saying?
I do. That's very, very commendable.
And let me put in a plug. I've got the greatest in-laws in the entire world. Bonnie and Leon Ziegler are 2 of the greatest humans in all of history.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm glad not everyone is so lucky when it comes to in-laws. So
that's a true story.
I am glad for you. But it makes you putting this effort foremost made me think of what you said at the beginning, how ultimately liberty in the end helps everyone. Yeah. And that's why it's something worth striving for. I think worth what you're doing. And it's similar at VIA. We don't get paid or get a salary. Run just from donations, and this is just something that we do as volunteers to be able to help.
And thank God you do it. Like, we need people like that out there on the front lines.
Yeah. Well, we need people like you too, because part of what we do in helping people, whether it's through litigation or through charity, is to also show, hey, there is a better way to do things than
Absolutely.
relying on the state, relying on the government. So
Right on.
thank you so much for the work that you are doing in Missouri, and hopefully continue to have successes.
Yeah, sure enough. And we look forward to having you here in the state.
I'll be happy to come. So thanks so much for being on the show today, Dave. You have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like what we do here, please like, share, subscribe, comment, and go over to our website where you can offer donations, request help us help people who are in need voluntarily. And we'll see you next time.